All the applications we've created so far will always begin with the same values they were created with. We've explored text fields and data pickers, but we haven't ever saved any of that information for the next time the application loads or for when the iPhone is restarted. Now, some of the time this is okay. If your application is simple, it may be able to load and unload repeatedly without there ever being a problem with this. But it's more likely that you'll want to save some data to persist it to storage on the iPhone so it can last when your application has quit and restarted or when the device itself is restarted. Your first key question needs to be, what kind of data are you saving? You might be saving just a few simple values, some strings, booleans, and arrays. A very easy way to save these is you can save them to a property list file. These are great because many of the most common objects, things like dictionaries, strings, and arrays, have convenient methods to save their contents directly out to a file. You might be saving application settings or preferences. Now, Apple has a very well-defined set of rules for these, which essentially means you tell it what settings you want to define, and it takes care of saving your data and even generating the interface for you. But that does mean that these settings will be accessed through the settings application on the iPhone, not your application. So it does require that the user have exited out of your application to do it, and then go into the settings app where there'll be an entry for your own program. So these are really good for general settings, but not so good for information that changes a lot or needs to change while your application is running. Now, if the data in your application can't be easily stored in a property list or a simple object, you can look at two of the provided mechanisms for storing more complex content: Core Data and SQLite. SQLite is, not surprisingly, a lightweight SQL database that's built into the iPhone OS, and it's been available to use since version 2.0. Core Data is newly available on the iPhone with version 3.0, although it's been available to Mac desktop programmers for a while. They can both store complex data. Now, if you're someone who lives and breathes SQL, SQLite is probably more your thing. Whereas if you'd prefer a persistence mechanism that's more like saving and retrieving objects and object graphs, then Core Data is for you. Now, a full exploration of either of these is beyond the scope of this course, but if you're interested in either, here's where to look. In the iPhone Dev Center, you'll find the iPhone Reference Library. And in that, down on the left-hand side, you'll find a whole series of entries, including Core Data. In Core Data itself, you'll find such things as the Getting Started with Core Data guide, which will give you a lot of information and some sample projects to use. Although the interesting quote I find here under prerequisites: Core Data is not an entry-level technology, and it leverages many other Cocoa technologies and design patterns. So what I suggest you do is really go through the simple examples that we're going to show, and then if you're interested in Core Data, come back to it after you're familiar with things like preferences and saving simple data on the iPhone. And finally, if you are very familiar with C-style programming and saving out to C-style file streams, you can even do that if you want, though I do find that many of the more convenient methods that are built into this OS are more worthwhile to use. So the next question has to be, well, where are you actually saving to? The iPhone does actually have a file system, but it's not what you're used to. You can't just access the iPhone's file system. You can only access your little sandboxed part of it. Every application gets its own documents folder, as well as a library and a temp folder. And apart from a few notable exceptions, such as reading the built-in address book or from the iPod library, you're limited to reading and writing just from your documents folder. You're sandboxed. You can't read other applications' data, and they can't read yours. Now, what that also means is the path to this document library is not obvious and not your decision. You'll have to ask the iPhone OS to give it to you before you can start to use it. So you can only read and write for your own area, and other applications can only read and write from there, so they can't touch yours. You can read some of the built-in data parts, such as the iPod library and address book. Now, when do you save? Well, we'd like to think that our application is special and that the users will treat it kindly. But the truth is that any moment the user can hit their home screen button and your app is going to have to exit immediately. This is not a multitasking system where your application runs in the background until the user comes back to it. There are a few applications which can stay in the background, like the iPod app and the mail applications, but those are Apple's applications, not yours. So your user's not going to click save. They're going to exit immediately, and you're going to need to respond to that very, very quickly. Bear in mind that the iPhone OS itself can also make your application exit at any moment, say if a call is coming in or if it's running low on batteries. The perfect event is an event called application will terminate. This will be called by the OS when something is triggering your application and it has to leave immediately. This is not the time and place to pop up UI alert views and ask questions. It's the time to get out and get out as quickly as possible. And with those things in mind, we can now go on and see a couple of examples of saving data on your iPhone.